Hey there! So we started discussing this wonderful service, which is Azure Databricks. And previously, I was connecting to our data lake using this unsecure, the worst method possible. Namely, I used account keys. Fortunately, there are other ways we can use to do this much better. And that's the topic for today. So let's get started. All right. So let's talk about connecting to a data lake from our Azure Databricks. And why is this important? So let me draw something. Now, if you recall our architecture, it looks like this. So we have our Databricks workspace. So this is Databricks that we use primarily for data transformations. And in our case, what it does is to basically interact with a data lake. So below, we've got our data lake, ADLSg2, and this data is read, transformed, and then saved back to a data lake. So this connectivity between Databricks to data lake is super important to make it correct. Now, obviously, Databricks can connect to other services as well, not only to a data lake, but in our case, we'll focus on this Databricks to data lake connectivity. So that's the topic for today. And you'll see today that the stuff that we covered so extensively in the past, those various authentication methods that ADLSg2 exposes, it will come handy today because you'll be able to see which of those methods are supported and what they actually mean. So let's start discussing a way to connect to data lake. So connecting to ADLSg2, obviously from Databricks. And we've got various ways to do this. Now, the method that I used so far was the worst method possible. This was this account key. Fortunately, there are better ways. So let me start with the one that Databricks is promoting right now a lot. So basically, they created something called Unity Catalog, which is a thing that we'll cover in future episodes. What we've got to know at this moment is that this Unity Catalog is a way that Databricks believes data governance should be handled. And they are pushing this Unity Catalog to more and more areas inside Databricks. And they say, this is how you should do this. All the other methods are bad. Great, but the reality is that many companies don't use Unity Catalog yet. Either because they have older solutions that were created before Unity Catalog was created, and Unity Catalog is a pretty new feature inside Databricks, or maybe there is no approval from the security team to use Unity Catalog yet in the company scope. So you have to use some other methods that were available before Unity Catalog was created. And let me cover those as well. But if you go to Databricks documentation, they will say use Unity Catalog because that's how you should do this. And that's the reason why they call all remaining methods either legacy or deprecated. So let me call them legacy methods. And I use double quotes here because they are not really legacy. They're just alternatives to Unity Catalog. So we are fine to still use them. They are not going anywhere. They will still keep working. Now, from those legacy methods, we've got several that we can choose from. The one that I used previously was to use account key. Account key. And you should remember that account key is just this string that grants you full access to a storage account. Very bad method of connecting to a data lake because usually you don't need such wide permissions. So that's one thing. And secondly, I hard-coded it explicitly in my notebook. So this value was available in history. So it was double bad. So don't do this, never ever. So let me draw this set phase. Account key is a no-go for us. Obviously, that's the fastest method when you just want to test something. In such cases, it's fine to use this, but don't do this in your real projects. So what are the better ways of doing this? And we've got some. So the first method of those better ones is simply to use a service principal. Like so. So how would it work? So let me draw something. So we would still have our Databricks workspace from which we would like to connect to our data lake. So let me draw it below. So this is our ADLSg2, and we would like to make use of service principal. And at this moment, you should be familiar with this concept of a service principal. You can think of it like a technical account, some service account that we create explicitly in Azure, that we can later use to grant some permissions. And for example, I used service principal when I was doing CI/CD for Data Factory. And those service principals were created and used by CI/CD pipelines in Azure DevOps to connect to Azure, namely to Azure Data Factory, and deploy stuff there. So what we'll do in this scenario will be like this. So I will create a service principal that would be granted some access on our data lake. And you know that in the case of service principals, we have two methods available. We can use either role-based access control, those roles such as storage blob data contributor, storage blob data reader, and so on. And we can also use ACLs if we require more granular access. But today, let's just focus on the simplest method. So I will just use a role. So let me go for this scenario. And by the way, all of those methods that I will be talking about today are described in documentation in this Connect to Data Lake article. The link will be provided in a video description. All right, so let me jump into Azure portal, mainly to Microsoft Entra ID, because that's the place when we can create service principals. So to do this, I will go to App Registrations tab, and I will create a new registration, basically a new service principal. I've got to give it a name like Databricks Service Principal and simply register it. And that's it. Then later on, we will need to authenticate somehow as the service principals. And there are various ways we can do this. I will use the simplest method. So I will create a secret for this principal, which you can treat as a password. So to do this, I will go into Certificates and Secrets tab, and I will create a new client secret. So let's do this. Let's give it a description for access from Databricks. Let's set it a validity period for 6 months. That's fine. And here we've got the value. And important thing is to copy this value somewhere, because later on it will not be available. So I will copy it to Notepad, and I will use it later on. All right, so our service principal is created. So we have this part. Then we will obviously have to grant it permissions to our data lake. And to do this, I will use role-based access control. And I have my Tibble Data Lake demo storage account. That's a data lake that has some roles already assigned. So I can check them by going to access control and then role assignments. And here I should see that actually we've got a group, Entra group, called the data lake contributor that already has this storage blob data contributor role. So that's the set of permissions that we need actually for Databricks, because I want it to be able to read and write data from the whole data lake. So what I will do will be to add my service principal to this data lake contributor group. And again, to do this, I will go into Microsoft Entra, then to groups. I will find my group, it was data lake contributor, and simply add a new member, this new principal. It was Databricks service principal, yeah, that's the one. And that's it. So the configuration is done. And please note that in this data lake contributor group, we also have already some other identities, some other principals. So we've got an ingest account, that's a user, which was used by a logic app, if I recall correctly. And we've got two service principals, one that was used by Data Factory and one that was used by Synapse Pipelines. And right now we've added the service principal that we'll use inside Databricks. All right, great. So let's jump into Databricks and let me create a new notebook. And let me call it access via service principal hard-coded. And why hard-coded? You will see this in a second. In the meantime, let me open the notebook that we used previously. I think it was called Hello World, because that was the notebook that we used to connect to our data in a data lake. So let me grab all right, let's grab this statement and we'll modify it. So that will be the code that we'll use to connect to my data lake. Obviously, I've got to change the path to indicate that I want to read data from my data lake and using ABFS protocol. And it will be our Tibble data lake demo data lake to which we want to connect. So let me set it here. And we want to connect to a row container. Let's just display the contents of this row container. And now, if I execute this, and I'm connected to our demo cluster, it obviously failed, because right now I haven't configured the access to my data lake. So Databricks doesn't know how it should connect, and that's expected. So let's configure it properly using our newly created service principal. And to do this, I will simply go to documentation and find a part that talks about how we can connect using a service principal. And now, this configuration can be done in two places. Either inside a notebook, that's what we are going to do right now. So the configuration will be valid only in the scope of the whole notebook. Or alternatively, we could do this at the scope of the whole cluster, which means that every notebook that is run on this cluster will already have this configuration available, so the access should work just fine. But right now I will do this only for this notebook. All right, so let me grab this piece of the code from documentation and I will update it in a second. So let's add it here and let's fill those placeholders. Now, the first thing that we have to fill is the service credential part, and they do it in a more secure way. Right now, I will do this in a fast way just to show you that this method works. So basically here, the service credential, it will contain our secret of a service principal. Basically, it's password, the thing that we created in Entra, and that I copied to a notepad. So let me copy it. And obviously, showing this value or hard coding this value is a very bad practice, so don't do this. It's just for the demonstration purpose. And then we've got to set those various configuration settings for our Spark session. That will tell Databricks, hey, if I want to connect to this specific storage account inside this notebook, then do this in the following way. So the first of all, I've got to indicate or write which storage account I have in mind. And we know that this is this Table Data Lake demo storage account. So let me replace it in every place where it should be updated, like so. Then we've got to change this application ID part. And here application ID is just an identifier of our service principal. So again, Databricks would know as whom we want it to connect. And to find it, let me go to my service principals, especially the one that I've just created. It was this Databricks service principal. And here we have its application ID or client ID. So let me copy it and let's paste it to our notebook. All right. And finally, I've got to indicate, all right, but which Azure directory, which Azure tenant are we talking about? And again, this can be taken from our service principal. So this is this directory ID or tenant ID. So let me grab this and let's paste it here. And those fields, those identifiers, they are not secrets. They can be placed safely here using open text. The service principal secret, it's a completely different story. We'll do this better in a second. But for now, let's just verify if this method works. So let me run the configuration part. And right now, if I rerun our display command that tries to go to a data lake and read the content of a row directory, row container, this time it worked because we instructed Databricks, hey, please use this particular service principal that is granted proper permissions whenever I want to connect to my data lake. So that's so simple. So revisiting our diagram, what we did was to add a configuration part inside our notebook that told, please just use this service principal to connect to this data lake. And because we handled the security stuff outside of Databricks, it was completely fine to use it. So that's the method you can use. And if you recall those various authentication methods that we covered in the case of data lakes, you should remember that was this one of those methods, those airbag and ACLs, in a case of which we know who is connecting. So that's the preferred method or the recommended method. But there are others. So if for some reason we don't want to create a service principal, or maybe we cannot do this, we can use yet another method that simply uses SAS tokens that we covered also in the past. All right, so let's do this using SAS token. So let me copy this part that is used to display the contents of our row container from a data lake. Let me add a new notebook. Let's call it access via SAS token. And let me paste this part. And again, if I run this cell, it should fail because in the scope of this notebook, we didn't configure the connectivity part because previously we did it at the notebook level, not at the cluster level. So it failed, but it was expected. All right, so how to do this using SAS token? And to make it work, I will go to my storage account, to shared access signatures, those SAS tokens, and I will create this account level SAS token. It's fine to use this. I will just restrict it to a blob service and to container object type. Let me set some validity period and let me generate our SAS token. All right, so the SAS token is here and we'll use it in a second. So how to use it? And again, let's go to documentation and let's just simply copy the part of the code that talks about using SAS tokens. So let me paste it here. And again, we've got to replace this storage account placeholder with the name of our storage account to which we want to connect. And it is to be done in 3 places. And secondly, we've got to provide the SAS token itself, its value. And again, here I will do this in an unsecure method, not recommended, but I want to do it in a quick and fast way. Later on, we'll do this better. So let me grab this SAS token and let me paste it here, like so. If I execute this, it will make the configuration of this session ready. So the connectivity should work this time. And yes, it worked, but this time I connected to a data lake using this short-lived SAS token that I set its validity period for a week or so. So that's yet another method of connectivity. And they worked, right? The issue is that, well, I hard-coded those sensitive values here in this notebook and in the other one, which was this one. So we have this hard-coded stuff, which is very bad. So don't do this. You should remember about this automatic version history that keeps track of your notebook content, so the value will be stored there and available to just everyone. So no. Fortunately, and there is a way to do this in a better way. And you should already remember that in case of such sensitive values, we can use yet another feature of Azure, yet another service called Azure Key Vault. So let's add it to our diagram. So let's say that this is our Key Vault. And we'll make use of it. So what I will do is to add a secret to this Key Vault. And in this case, it will be simply a secret used to authenticate as a service principal. Then, inside the Databricks, I will create something called a secret scope. And secret scope is simply a way to make those secrets from a specific Key Vault available from Databricks. So secret scope. So simply Databricks will be able to read those secrets and then use them without us explicitly hard coding the value in a notebook, because that's the bad way. Now, important thing to remember is that those secret scopes, they work only in case of Key Vaults that are configured using access policy mode. So access policy mode has to be used here. And let me show you what I mean by this access policy. So actually it should be access policy mode, not access policy used. Like so. So I already have some Key Vault called demo Key Vault that is configured to use this fault access policy. That's fine, because that's the only method out of these two that is supported by those secret scopes inside the Databricks. The recommended method using role-based access control is not yet supported, but that's fine. We'll use it anyway. All right, so how to do this? So let me create a new notebook, but first let me copy the part that we'll use to connect to our data lake. So let's give it a name, access via service principal with secret scope. And obviously at this moment this connectivity will fail because it is not configured in scope of this notebook, and we've got to do something with the secret scope. All right, But before we create the secret scope, let's add our secret to a key vault. So right now, we don't have this service principal secret available inside our key vault. So let me create it. So let's add a new secret. Let's give it a name. Databricks service principal secret. Let me give it a name, value that I have in my notepad, like so. So the secret has been created and we'll read it from our Databricks notebook. And now, before we go further, let me show you the access policies that are configured at this moment. And access policies, they simply define who has what access to our key vault. And right now, there are only two access policies defined. One for me as the admin, and I can do everything. And we've got a policy for a group called Data Key Vault Secret Reader that has a get and list permissions for secrets. Fine, but right now there is nothing that would allow Azure Databricks to connect to our key vault. But that's fine, we'll do this in a second. Alright, so how to create secret scopes? So let me open a documentation. Because the way to create a secret scope is a kind of a secret. There's no this nice UI or nice button in UI available that will allow us to create it. Now we've got to use this secret URL. Alright, so how to create this Azure Key Vault backed secret scope using UI? So we've got to go to this strange address which contains two parts. The first one is the address of our Databricks instance, and then we've got this hash secrets create scope value. So let me use this inside our notepad to grab this value, to construct this URL. All right. So the first thing we've got to grab is this HTTPS Azure Databricks net part of the address. That's the address of my workspace. So let me copy it. Let me copy it to Notepad, like so. And apart from that, we've got to add these secrets and create scope part. So let's do this. So that's this strange URL that have to be used in order to make use of those secret scopes, to create them. All right, so let's copy this URL. Let's go to this address and hopefully it works. All right, so again, I'm in this Databricks portal where I can create a secret scope, this mapping to some key vault. And let's give it a name. So let's call it demo scope. Then I have to indicate who will be able to manage my secret scope. Basically, who will be able to set permissions and accesses to this data lake, to this key vault, sorry. And that's the place where premium tier of Databricks differs from the standard one. Because in case of premium tier, I can set granular access to my secret scope and then to specific secrets, which is what we want to have usually. In case of standard tier, we don't have this privilege. Basically, everyone will be able to access this secret scope and everyone will be able to use them. Which in many cases is not what we want, because that's the reason we have secrets, to protect them and not to expose them to every user of Databricks workspace. So premium tier has this advantage. So let's continue creating the secret scope, and we've got to provide two values that would tell Databricks which key vault we have in mind. So the first value we've got to provide is something called DNS name, but it's easy to grab. So let's jump into our key vault, to its properties, and this DNS name can be taken from this vault URI value. So let me copy it and go to our UI, and let's simply paste it. All right. And the second thing is the resource ID of my key vault. And again, it can be taken from the same properties page of the key vault. This is this part. So let me copy it and let me paste it. And if I didn't make any mistake, this secret scope should be created in a second. And it's done. And Databricks, in the meantime, it checked some permissions whether I am allowed to create those secret scopes. And because I'm the admin, it went fine. So right now, we have this secret scope created that should allow us to read secrets in a secure way from Azure Key Vault. All right, so let me close this page because we won't need any more. And before we go any further, let's revisit our Key Vault. And let's take a look at access policies. What has changed because we added this secret scope? So let me refresh it, and you'll see this new access policy that was created by Databricks that allows Azure Databricks application to get and list our secrets. So Databricks will be able to just read our secrets from this particular key vault. It will not be able to add new secret or to modify its value, but it will be able to read them. All right, that's fine. So let's do this in a more secure way. All right, so let's open the notebook in case of which we had this stuff hard-coded. So let me copy it here. And I copied it because this part is fine, where we have the storage account already configured, service principal, and our directory ID. What will change is this part. So no longer this service principal secret will be hard-coded. No, this time it will be taken from a key vault by using a secret scope. All right, so how it could be done? And if we go to documentation, that's this line, this original placeholder. It was done in a way to use secret scopes. And you can see already that again here we are using these dbutils methods that Databricks created on top of Databricks to make management easier. And they are really quite handy. And what do we have to do here? Well, we've got to provide a name of our secret scope and then what secret we want to read from it. All right, but I don't remember what the scope name we used. So how to list all secret scopes? And again, let me just paste the command that will do this. And yes, we'll use dbutils.secrets methods. So this command will display all secret scopes that we defined. And yes, it was called demo scope. So let's use it here, demo scope. All right, but what was the secret? Can we display names of the secrets? And the answer is sure. Let's just use this secrets list method and provide a name of our secret scope. And it was demo scope, like so. And let's run it. And here we've got all secrets that are available inside this key vault via secret scope. And the one that we want to use is this Databricks service principal secret. So let me copy it and paste the name of the secret, not the value, but the name. All right. So if everything is configured properly, then this command should go to our key vault, grab the secret, and use it to configure connection to our data lake by using a service principal. And let's finally try to execute our display command and it worked. So we were able to connect to our data lake by using a service principal without hard coding its secret. So that's the method that I use a lot because it's quite a good method. So let's indicate that, well, this service principal, out of those legacy methods, I use service principal 1 because it's pretty good. But please remember to use secret scope here. Don't hard code your secrets in plain text. And now, obviously, those secret scopes, they could be used also to store our SAS tokens or our account keys, because it is just a reference to a key vault. But out of those three so-called legacy methods, the one that I prefer to use is the service principal 1, because I like it the most. All right, great. But we've got something more. Apart from Unity Catalog and those legacy methods. So let me draw yet another line. So let's go into the area that Databricks calls deprecated methods, which means that you should not use them for some reason. But again, the reality is that they are widely used. So you should be familiar with those methods, and you shouldn't be surprised when you see them, because in real life they are used very often. So we've got those deprecated methods. Deprecated methods. And here I want to cover two of them. So the first one is simply called months or month points. And basically, months were created to simplify the access patterns to our data lake. Because if you take a look at this syntax, you will notice that, well, we've got to provide this protocol, this ABFS, which might be a little bit confusing to users. Secondly, we've got to provide an explicit path to our container, then to our storage account suffixed by this strange DFS course Windows net, which again, regular users might not be familiar with. And finally, this is the URL syntax. And you might be using some libraries or methods that don't accept this type of paths. They might need to use those paths like on a disk drive. And month points, well, they solve all those stuff, but they have some other issues as well. So let me just add it. So month points, well, they simplify access patterns to our data on a data lake. Access patterns. The thing is that, well, it has a lot of disadvantages. One of them is that they are not supported with Unity Catalog. So if you want to use Unity Catalog, then forget about month points. All right, but how does it work? How does it look like? So again, let's draw our data lake. So let's say this is our ADLS. Gen2, inside which we will have some hierarchy, some structure. So let's say we've got our row container, as always, that has some directories, some files, and so on. We might have some conformed container, or whatever we want to call it, and so on and so on. And now, when we are creating a month point, we'll have to provide basically three things. So first of all, we've got to provide a location to which this specific month point points. So in my case, I'll create it like this, that my month point will point to a row container on my data lake. So location of data. So that's the first thing we will have to provide inside our mount point. Secondly, we'll have to indicate which driver, which protocol we want to use to connect to our data lake. And in this case, we'll use ABFS. And finally, what we want to define inside our mount point are credentials. So how to connect to our data lake. And those three things together, they will be encapsulated inside our mount point. So end users later on, when they will be using this mount point, they will not care at all about all these three things. They will just use it as a regular path. All right, so how to create it? So let me open documentation. This mounting cloud objects on Azure Databricks. And let me grab a syntax. So that's the one for Python. So let me copy it. And let's create a new notebook. Access via mount points. All right, so let's add this part of the code from documentation and let's start to fill it from the end. So this dbutils fs mount command, it creates a mount point. And let's start configuring it. So the first thing we've got to do is to provide a source, basically a location to which our mount point should point. And in our case, we know that it is a raw container on a table data lake demo storage account. Like so. So that's the first part. Secondly, we've got to indicate, all right, how do I want this mount point to be called? And they always start with this /mnt part. And here I will just call it raw. So it will clearly indicate that, yes, it points to a raw container inside our data lake. And finally, we've got some extra configuration that will be read from this part above, inside which we'll specify how we want to connect to this data lake. And here, in this case, I will continue to use service principal-based authentication because we have it configured already. So let me simply configure those values. Like this was the application ID of our service principal. Then we've got this retrieval part of our secret from a key vault. And finally, we've got to provide my directory ID of my Azure, like so. And I think that's all. So let's create this mount point. It will take a few seconds to create, and later we will see how it can be used inside our queries, inside our notebooks. All right, so it has been created, and actually we can list all available mount points. And to do this, we'll again use this dbutils set of commands, fs mounts. And you'll see in a second that apart from the mount point we've just defined, there are some other ones that are available out of the box together with Databricks. All right, but how do I query this mount point? And it's super simple. So let me grab our command that we used previously, like so, and let's replace this URL path with our mount point. And we know that our mount point is called mnt/raw. So let me copy this and paste it. And let's execute this command and let's see if it will work. And yep, it works. And please note how easy it is to get access to data from end users' points of view, especially if they are not familiar with all of this setup. All they have to know is that, hey, there is this mount point called row, or standardized, conformed, or however you want to call it, that will point to some place in a data lake. And that's it. So that's super easy for them, because it abstracts all this configuration part. And honestly, maybe as a data engineer, you won't be required to configure all of this stuff. Maybe it will be done by one of your colleagues, and you will be given this mount point to use, and that's all. Who knows? Now, the cool thing about mount points is that they are persisted. So let me write it down and then explain what I mean by this. So they are persisted, meaning that even if I close my notebook or shut down the cluster, this mount point will be still there. So it is enough to configure it once, and this configuration will be valid and accessible to everyone. And that's the huge drawback of using mount points. That mount points or mounts are visible to every user who is using this Databricks workspace. And there is no way to secure this. So basically, every user that is granted access to your Databricks workspace will be able to use this row mount point and query your data. And not only query, because we used a service principal that was granted storage blob data contributor role, which means effectively that every user will be able to modify your data on a raw data lake. So that's a huge watch out for you. If it is fine to share this mount point for every user. It might not be fine, for example, if you are sharing the same Databricks workspace by multiple teams and you've got to restrict the access somehow to a data lake. So that's a huge disadvantage from security point of view of mount points, that they are visible to everyone. But still, mount points are widely used. And I'm sure that sooner or later you will encounter this strange syntax, this MNT something, and you might start wondering what this is. Where does it point to? And it's simple to check. In this case, we know that it points to our raw container on my data lake. So that's how mounts work. But from Databricks point of view, they are considered deprecated. So if you have a possibility of not using them and switching to Unity Catalog, maybe that's something you should consider. Alright, and the final method that again I'm using a lot, even though it is called deprecated, is something called AD credentials passthrough. Credentials passthrough. And this method is super useful. But it requires, first of all, premium tier of Databricks. So again, those nice features, they are not available in the standard tier. You've got to use premium. But in reality, most of the projects will use premium tiers anyway. So it is a premium tier. And secondly, it requires some configuration inside our cluster. So actually, I will just create a new cluster with this AD credentials passthrough configured. I could use update my demo cluster, but I will just create a new one. And let me call it AD credentials passthrough. I will keep it small cluster, single node, accessible only by me, without photon. I don't need this. For sure, let's make sure that it will shut down after 15 minutes of no activity. And the important thing to configure is this under advanced options, enable credentials pass-through for user-level data access. So that's something that has to be checked. And let me create the compute. And now it will take a few minutes for this cluster to be provisioned. So in the meantime, let me explain what this option does. All right, so again, let me draw our scenario. So we have our Databricks workspace, and we have our data lake. And we want to make sure that Databricks is able to connect to a data lake in a secure way, in a proper way, without granting excessive access. And those methods that I covered previously, they work just fine. But what if I have multiple users connecting to my Databricks workspace, and I would like to use permissions that each of them already has on a data lake? So I don't want to use account key or a service principal or a SAS token. No, I want to use permissions of the user who is executing some command on a Databricks. So it looks like this. So we have some user who is granted some access on a data lake by using role-based access control, by using ACLs. And whenever this user is connecting to my Databricks workspace and runs some notebook, I would like to make use of those permissions. So the access would flow like this. So finally, at the data lake level, here, permissions of these users will be checked, not the permissions of some service principal, which opens few scenarios for us. So for example, we can safely reuse the same Databricks workspace and give it to multiple users because the data access is managed elsewhere. We manage data access here. So every user will have access only to that data that we allowed him to access, which is super cool. All right, so how to do this? We'll see if the cluster has been already provisioned. If not, then I will wait a second. So let me create a new, actually we created the notebook already. So no, we didn't. We created the cluster. So let's add a notebook like access via AD credentials pass through, like so. And what changes? So let me open documentation. And actually, let me open first some command that we used previously to access our data lake. All right. So that's the command that we used so far to connect to a data lake. And I will use my AD credentials pass-through cluster that is configured in a specific way. Or actually, let's do this first with this demo cluster to show you the difference. So let's connect to the demo cluster, which has not the AD credentials pass-through configured. So if I run this, it should fail because connectivity is not yet established, configured. Now, if I switch to my AD credentials pass-through, then this time Databricks will try to use my permissions to read data from a data lake. And actually, I don't remember if I'm granted permissions. We'll see. And it failed with 403 error that I'm not authorized. So it means that me, as Piotr, because I'm connected as Piotr, I don't have this data access to a data lake. So let's change this. And let's first verify whether that's really true. So I'm back in my storage account and let's check my access. If really I don't have the access. And yes, alright, so I have the owner role, but it's a control plane role. It doesn't grant data access. And I've got some user access administrator role. Alright, but indeed I don't have this data plane access. So let's grant it. And I could grant it explicitly to me, this storage blob data contributor role, but I prefer to do this in a better way by using groups. So we've got this data lake contributor role, and let's add myself to this group. And now it might take a few minutes, and I've just been added. It might take a few minutes for those permissions to be propagated inside Azure. So let's see if it will work this time. So again, I'm in my Databricks notebook that uses this AD credentials passthrough cluster. Previously, it didn't work because I wasn't authorized yet to access the data. But if I run it now, let's see, maybe permissions were propagated already. And it works. See, I didn't have to do anything inside Databricks. I didn't have to configure any access here because I have this AD credentials passthrough cluster, and Databricks knew to use my permissions to connect to a data lake. If I switch back to our demo cluster that doesn't have this feature enabled, the same command should fail because here I don't have the access. Yep, it fails. If I switch back to the cluster with AD credentials passthrough configured, it will work just fine. So that's how it works. Now, it looks like the best option to use this AD credentials passthrough, but it has some limitations, actually quite a lot of them, that you should be aware of. So for example, it doesn't work with Data Factory. So imagine that you use Data Factory as your orchestration engine, and from Data Factory you would like to execute your Databricks notebook and use a managed identity of Data Factory to get access to a data lake. Sorry, not supported. That's really bad. The same with the orchestration engine that is built inside Databricks that we'll cover in the future, that is called workflows. It also is not supported with AD credentials passthrough. But what is nice, that we can actually combine this AD credentials passthrough with months, and you can create a month that will work with AD credentials passthrough options. So it works with months, which means that we can create a month point, and then inside, instead of hard coding our credentials to use some kind of a service principal, it will dynamically use the identity of the user that is connecting for a month point. So that's pretty neat. All right, and that was it for today. So today I covered various ways we can use to connect to our data lake from Databricks. And I know it might be a boring stuff for you because it is not pure data engineering stuff. But as a data engineer, you will need this configured to be able to work with your data. If you have luck, it will be done by someone else, by some platform administrator. But in many cases, it will be you that will have to configure this connectivity part, and it's good to know what options are available. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and take care.